All right, I guess we'll start since it's 11. My name is Belinda Archibong. I am an assistant professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University in New York. This is joint work with my co-author Nonso, who is at ERSA and Stellenbosch, and it's a working paper that we are doing, trying to understand the role of forced labor through examining convict labor in the early to mid 20th century in British colonial Africa. So to give some background on how we came to this topic, so these are some news articles from 2017. So I think on the left is from March 2017. I forget the date, it's on there, September 2017 on the right. And on the left, there was an opera in South Africa because I think Helen Zille is her name, and she's one of the, I guess, call her ministers, premier, I forget the exact title, of one of the provinces in South Africa. And so she tweeted this statement about, basically people shouldn't get so down on I'm paraphrasing, shouldn't get so down on colonialism because at least colonialism led to the construction of infrastructure in Africa, right? So this is colonialism was good, quote unquote, for constructing infrastructure projects in Africa and for economic development more generally. And so there was a huge uproar of her comments on Twitter, right? So yeah, I think she was prosecuted or questioned by the public prosecutor in South Africa, and it was this huge deal, right, that these comments spurred. Similarly, there was a whole case in academia that was happening in 2017 where a scholar also wrote this article titled The Case for Colonialism, arguing very similar things, right? So that colonialism was good for infrastructure development in Africa, right? So this is this ongoing debates about what is the legacy of colonialism in Africa. So we said, okay, this is interesting. This is a debate that has been going on for a while, right? And one of the things that we wanted to understand is, well, okay, if we say that infrastructure, right, the railroad, the roads, etc., are important parts or important for economic development today and are important investment during the colonial era, who actually built this infrastructure, right? So specifically, we wanted to understand the contribution of native labor, so native African labor, to colonial infrastructure or colonial era infrastructure, the roads, the railroads, the mines, etc. So how do we understand the role of Africans in constructing a lot of these infrastructure projects that have spurred a lot of this debate on the legacy of colonialism in Africa, right? So these are the questions that we said that we should try and answer. So first of all, there's a literature in history, a historical literature trying to understand the role of native taxation in funding colonial era projects. So how do we understand the role of particularly labor? So this is kind of understudied in this fiscal literature. Labor taxes, and I will explain what that is in a minute, and labor coercion, forced labor in particular, in colonial revenues and public works expenditure. Can we get a share or a sense of kind of a scale of the share, the contribution of labor taxes of native labor in colonial era revenue and expenditure? So that was one of the things that we wanted to find out. So knowing, again, public works expenditure, railroad expenditure, road expenditure, etc. And so there's a kind of secondary question about the role of these labor taxes and forced labor, right, in terms of how it's substituted with direct taxation in the colonies. So that's one question. The second question, which I'll present more results on in this paper, because we ended up having these questions in two separate papers because the paper was getting quite massive, is what is the impact, right? So there's this historical literature trying to explain the kind of relationship between public works construction, railroad construction, infrastructure construction, and kind of labor shortages in Africa, right? So what are the roles of these, you call them positive economic shocks, labor demand shocks, on the use of forced labor in Africa? And so we're going to use prison labor. So I'm going to show you some evidence from Nigeria circa 1920 through 1940, and we're going to use prison labor as kind of our proxy for forced labor, which we have data for in colonial Nigeria. And I'm going to show you some results, again, trying to understand the dynamics of how forced labor, how this prison labor system worked in terms of constructing public works projects in Nigeria. I'm going to show you some results from the post-colonial era as well, circa 1971 through 1996, for which we have data for, and show you that, the kind of relationship between labor shortages and the use of forced labor, or in our case, labor shortages and the use of prisoners, right, prisons, convicts, does not hold in the post-colonial era. Actually, the relationship is quite different, it seems, from the econometrics in the post-colonial era, which kind of gives us some idea about the kind of difference in how prisoners are being used, between the colonial era and the post-colonial era. So I'll show some evidence on that as well. All right, so why do we care about labor coercion? Just very briefly, there's a whole literature in economics that has examined, or in the social sciences more generally, that has examined the role of labor coercion and institutions of labor coercion in shaping institutional outcomes, right? So, of course, there's the papers on slavery from Nathan Nunn and others. There's work that has been done trying to understand the role of apartheid and forced labor in South Africa on inequality, right? So racial inequality in South Africa today, which again sparked these comments from, or sparked the controversy over these comments from Helen Zille. And of course, there's Melissa Dell's work on the MITA and the long-term impacts of forced labor in the Peruvian MITA for economic development in Peru. So we said, okay, we know that labor coercion and institutions of labor coercion are very important for current economic development outcomes. So how do we, or can we get evidence from one particular case of labor coercion? So this is British colonial Africa. And specifically, we're going to show you evidence from Nigeria. We have a larger project looking across kind of all British colonies in Africa for which we have available data. So to give you a brief preview of the results, so as I mentioned, we have a whole separate paper that is examining just the share of forced labor, and convict labor in particular, in colonial Nigeria, in colonial revenues and expenditure. So just briefly, I'll show you some results here that show that convict labor, this aspect of forced labor, makes up a significant share of public works expenditure in British colonial Nigeria. So it's something like 40 to 140% of of public works expenditure in British colonial Africa, in British colonial Nigeria. I'm also going to show you some evidence that on the impact, or you say the very strong relationship between positive economic shocks and prison labor in the colonial era. So we find that positive economic shocks, so when you have these labor demand shortages, if you will, seem to increase the use of forced labor, the use of prison labor in colonial Nigeria. And I'll talk a little bit about that and why that holds as well. And I'll show you again that this result doesn't hold in the post-colonial era, right? So you actually see that the sign on prison labor, or prisoners rather, not prison labor, prisoners and positive economic shocks seems to switch during the post-colonial era. And again, I think we're hoping to add to this larger debate about the role of what are the costs of colonial infrastructure and the role of native labor in colonial infrastructure in kind of Europe's African colonies as well. Okay. So some brief background on labor coercion in British colonial Africa. There's a whole very detailed historical review in the paper, so I will not go into all of that here. But just to give you an idea of kind of the scale at which forced labor is being used in the colonies during this circa late 19th century through the mid-20th century period. So you have a bunch of labor ordinances that are at play in not just the British colonies, I'll focus on the British colonies, but in the French colonies, especially the French colonies were very well known for this actually in the literature. So I won't talk about that here, but I'll focus on British West Africa. So in British West Africa, you have these labor ordinances, right? So you have a kind of series of laws that were designed to pull African labor into the formal labor market, or the wage labor market. So you have things like the Masters and Servants ordinances that would say that, you can't quit your job without permission from the, usually white employers in colonial Africa. Vagrancy laws that dictated where Africans could be at what particular time of the day, and said, if you can't be on the street, you must be working, you must be gainfully employed, etc. Right? And these laws, lasted quite a bit. At least anecdotally, my mother has mentioned in Nigeria, like in Victoria Island, there were places, like circa 60s, 70s, where even native Nigerians could not go, right? So it was like white people could go, and Nigerians were not allowed to go after certain periods or after certain times of the day. Labor registration laws, pass laws, these native authority ordinances that said, these kind of, think of this as labor taxes. That said you had to donate, young men had to donate a certain amount of free labor to work on public works projects, the railroads, the roads, the mines, for the British colonies. So there are a number of kind of coercive contracts that are designed to coerce African labor into this kind of formal colonial labor system. All right. And I've listed some of the exact laws up there. And what was the goal, right? Why do you have these kind of coercive contracts? Why do you have all of this series of forced labor? So one, you hear a lot of this literature about kind of using labor as a form of control. So you hear a lot of the colonial officials would say things about labor being a civilizing influence for Africans, right? So you needed to civilize the native by making them work. A big one was, of course, the economic driver, right? So you often hear Africa as like much land, scarce labor. Chronic labor shortages was significant or kind of endemic in this period. you didn't have, so you had a situation where, colonial officials did not want to pay a market wage, right? It was high. They're trying to minimize the kind of revenue imperative. You're trying to minimize the costs of administration in the colonial empire. So they didn't want to pay a market wage. So they would have kind of wage ceilings, right? So where they would say, we're not paying you more than a certain amount to work in the public works sector, for instance. So that was definitely an incentive. And of course, you are an African farmer working in the agricultural sector. Do I work on my farm, earn, a more attractive wage, or do I go and work on these very back-breaking, horrible kind of railroad and mining projects that can be very nasty for very low wages? It's like, cost-benefit analysis, most people would choose not to work for these public works sector jobs. And of course, this was especially you hear these reports from South Africa, appeasing white settlers who would complain, especially after the abolition of slavery, about the cost of hiring native labor to work on kind of farms and plantations and things like that. So a lot of, lots of kind of reasons, both political and economic, for engaging in these coercive contracts. Okay. So one of the things that we're looking at specifically, because we don't have data on kind of the full scale of the use of forced labor, is we're going to look at prisons, right? And so the ways in which prison labor were used were many, right? So one of the things that would happen is that if you didn't adhere to these labor ordinances, you could be arrested, you're put in jail, and then your labor is used to work on the railroad or the road anyway, right? So consequences not participating in jail, and this goes on for quite a while, right? So you have these native ordinances, you have just imprisonment for things like breaking the native ordinance laws, or even like not paying taxes, things like that. And this continues up to like the mid-20th century, where due to pressure from African labor unions and also the ILO, you have finally abolished a lot of these things. And just pictures to show this, how this worked. So it's kind of laborers on the railroad. So I won't go into all of this in detail because I don't have too much time, but just to give you an idea that this is a very formal system, the use of prison labor, right? So very, very formalized. You have most of the prisoners that are coming in are the short-term laborers, right? So this is people with less than 6 months sentences are the bulk of the prisoners in our sample. And what are they doing? They're doing things like unskilled hard labor, like grass cutting, painting, refuse disposal, on roads and railroad projects or mining projects, hard labor, light labor. And about 73 to 91% of people in our sample in southern Nigeria are working, or prisoners are engaged in this labor, this like different types of labor. So I mentioned like the reason why you have this is like these chronic labor shortages, and so the idea from the historical literature is that when you have these positive economic shocks, so all of a sudden you have a labor shortage, you have this kind of labor demand shocks, you need labor, suddenly you don't want to pay your laborers a wage, a market wage, so what do? All of a sudden you start to see this increase in the use of forced labor, and we're going to show this through evidence on the increase in prisoners. And so how did this happen? So we often think about crime and punishment as being very linked, right? So many people think, oh, well, they're criminals, you commit a crime, you go to prison, so how is it happening that you're being coerced into prison when you have these labor shortages? So just very briefly, on the connection between crime and punishment, you could have multiple different types of punishments for the same crime, right? So this is kind of evidence from Kenya circa 1931 to 1938, and you basically see for kind of violations of the Masters and Servants ordinances in Kenya over this period, you can see the punishment of convicts by racial group, right? I don't have a pointer, but so you can see fine is red, prison is green, and whipping is blue, right? So 1931, Africans are the far left. You can see that prison is the kind of largest category for Africans, versus for Europeans, you have fines instead when they break these ordinances. And the pattern remains when you look at Africans and Europeans in 1938. So this is going on for quite a long time. Same crimes, very different punishment depending on if you were African versus if you were European. In Nigeria, what are people being convicted for? We don't have disaggregated data, but we do have a time series of kind of convictions by type of crime. And you can see this blue line, so over 50% of the crimes over the period of study, 1920 to 1940, for which prisoners are in jail for, are these kind of offenses against revenue, road, and social economy laws, basically for not paying taxes, right? So not paying taxes or not adhering to these native ordinance, native authority ordinance, labor ordinance laws. So that's what people were mostly in jail for over this period. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. So I won't give you too much more of the historical detail because that's in the paper, but let me just talk a little bit about the data and show you some of the results. So our main source of data on the prisoners comes from the British Blue Books. So these are the colonial era records from 1920 to 1938. And we have this at the province level. So it gives us very, very nice data on revenue, wages, public works expenditure, prisoners by, number of prisoners, by type, by sentence, etc. And then we also, for our economic shocks data, what we're going to use is rainfall deviations, right? So we're going to use climate data from NOAA and University of Delaware data. And also that we have kind of ongoing work looking at cash crop prices and trying to understand not just how rainfall shocks affect the use of prisoners and the use of forced labor, but how direct economic changes in economic prices, so the prices of agricultural commodities, cash crops, affect the kind of demand for labor, forced labor during this period. And then we're also going to use from the post-colonial era, we're going to go into the annual abstract of statistics from Nigeria over 1971 to 1995 and use that to see if the pattern of the relationship between economic shocks and prisoners remains the same in this post-colonial era, right? So very kind of extensive data gathering work. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, in colors, this is a very complex or busy chart, but in colors as the provinces, the red dots are the prisons, the colonial prisons. So I should note here that we're going to show you data from colonial prisons. All our estimates of forced labor are clearly kind of underestimates, because I told you we don't have the full sample of forced labor. And also there are other prisons here during this period. This is like the native prisons that are being overseen by the local chiefs that we don't have in this sample. So this is just the colonial prisons. And you see there are much more in the south of Nigeria, in red. And it's also interesting to see the kind of location of the prisons along the railroad in Nigeria, which is in black. But anyway, it's an aside. I will skip that. So just to give you a picture of what this data looks like, again, why we think that the relationship between economic shocks and prisons is very different in the colonial era versus the post-colonial era, right? So that's prisons per 100,000 population in 1920, 1930 on the left, and then in 1980 and 1995 on the right. So you kind of see the very different distribution, spatial distribution, in the number of prisoners and the distribution of prisoners between the colonial era and the post-colonial era in this data set. So already you can kind of, at least you can get an inkling that this relationship between rainfall shocks or economic shocks and forced labor prisoners is going to be very different in the colonial era and the post-colonial era. So this is it's kind of showing the picture of prisoners and prices, cash crop prices over this colonial period. I will skip over this. Same thing, Nigeria, I should mention, has this kind of very significant switch in the structure of the economy from these agricultural commodities, right, to customs tariffs, to direct taxes from petroleum profits. So from a kind of cash crop economy to an oil economy, circa 1970, 1980. And this is what we're showing with these oil prices here. Okay, so we'll skip over this, but just to give you an idea of where this cash crop production is happening. So basically, I'm showing this to especially focus on this palm oil producing region in the lower left corner. So that's where you really see this kind of intensifying of kind of prison labor when you have this positive economic shock. So when you have a positive rainfall shock, and also, when you have this positive kind of shock to palm oil prices, you see this increase in prisoners during the colonial era. And so just, for people who are curious of what this looks like, this is a page from the Blue Books. So we basically went into this data set, digitized this, got wages and all of that information from the British records. So just to remind you, these are the questions we're going to answer. First, give you some statistics I mentioned earlier on the share of labor taxes, the share of forced labor, prison labor in colonial revenues and expenditures. And second, what is the impact of these positive economic shocks on the use of prisoners, right, during the colonial era and in the post-colonial era. So to answer the first question, we're going to take a strategy from Van Wijnberg's paper in the Journal of Economic History and basically say, we know that prisoners are being employed to work. We know they're not being paid a wage. If they had been paid a market wage, what would the value of their labor have been to the colonial regime, right? And then we're going to take that share and we're going to divide it by our measure of public works expenditure in the colonial era to see kind of what the share of this value of labor coercion is in this overall colonial revenues and expenditure data. And then in terms of our econometric strategy for the second half, this is, we're going to do this kind of quadratic estimation strategy where what we really want to see is for this beta 2 in equation 2, what is the kind of sign on this? Is it less than 0? Is it positive? Is it negative? To understand if there's an inverted U shape between prisoners, right, and these rainfall shocks, economic shocks, or if it's a U shape, right? So, and I'll explain that in a minute when I show the regression. Let me skip over this because I don't have that much time. But just to give you an idea, this is a whole separate paper I mentioned. We do find that prison labor during this period is a significant share of public works expenditure. And we do find evidence that prisoners are being significantly undervalued relative to to kind of market wages for what their labor would have been if they had been on a kind of free market wage labor. Okay, so first set of regressions here. So what I want you to focus on is this column 4, so less than 6 months prisoners. It does work. So column 4. Now I mentioned that I want you to focus on the sign of this deviation squared term. And the way you can interpret this is that there's this inverted, so it's weakly negative, but significantly negative. And there's this inverted U shape between rainfall deviation squared and the number of prisoners with sentences less than 6 months, right? So these are these very short-term prisoners that are being employed on these labor projects that I mentioned before. And so essentially when you have this kind of median good year, right? So you see this very steep kind of increase in the number of prisoners is the way that we are interpreting this here in column 4. We do this by quintile to see this more clearly, and again, what we're interpreting this as is to say when you have in column 2, this is like, relative to quintile 1 and relative to quintile 3. So you have this kind of positive rainfall year. So it's not a flood, and it's not a drought. So it's like a somewhat positive rainfall year. You have this positive relationship with the prison population at this period. And this is the result from the post-colonial era. So you can see, I thought this was interesting, just on the deviation squared, the sign switches and switches significantly, right? So you go from this inverted U to this U shape. And we can talk more about this, I'm running out of time, right, after this. But essentially what we're interpreting this as is that you have this crime story, right, that's related like crime and punishment. You have more crime during periods of kind of negative economic shocks. And so you see this here, right? And this, at least in column 4, this story is more consistent with this crime story. And here we think this is more consistent with this, again, this kind of labor demand shock, positive demand shock, good rainfall year, inverted U, and more kind of short-term prisoners for forced labor. So I'll skip over that and just show you some very preliminary correlations on the cash crop prices. Again, I told you to focus on this palm oil prices. So this is the interaction of palm oil prices in palm oil price producing areas. And essentially when you have this kind of increase in palm oil prices in palm oil price areas, you see this positive and significant relationship between these short-term prisoners as well, right? So you see an increase which again, if you think about it in terms of crime, it's counterintuitive, right? When you have a positive economic shock, you think, okay, well, people have more money, so they shouldn't commit, if you think of a very strict link between crime and punishment, they shouldn't commit crime, right? Like theft. But here, it's like when you have this positive economic shock, you actually see more prisoners. And so I think we think this is more consistent with this labor demand shock story than with the kind of crime story that people usually think of when they think of prisoners in the literature. Anyway, okay, so I will conclude. So just to conclude, what we're showing in this paper is a lot, but one of the things that we wanted to show is that, first of all, you have forced labor, as exemplified by prisoners, make up a pretty significant share of colonial public works expenditure and fiscal capacity, right? So who built the railroad? Who built the roads? It's African labor and it's African taxes, essentially. So going back to this original debate about the kind of cost of colonial era infrastructure. And so we're using prison labor, which is a very, very small share of the overall share of forced labor, right, that's happening over this period, right? So I mentioned there are many, many different ways that forced labor are being used. We only have the data on prisoners, small share, but you still see this very kind of significant relationship with colonial era public works expenditure in particular. And we do find that these kind of positive economic shocks seem to increase the prison population in the colonial period, but this result does not hold during the post-independence period, suggesting that the mechanism is very different, right? So labor demand shock, or labor shortages, more labor demand versus a crime story in the post-colonial era, right? And so this is, something that we're working on, kind of ongoing, and we think it's very interesting because, this debate on kind of the use of prison labor is ongoing in Africa right now. This is a statement from the Tanzanian president about, he said, make the prisoners work, let them make bricks day and night. If they show laziness, kick them. You have laborers and for free. So it's almost word for word. It's very fascinating. Almost word for word the kind of discourse that the kind of colonial era officials were using when we talked about the use of forced prison labor, right? Anyway, so we're kind of trying to understand the long-term impacts of this domestic labor coercion on attitudes towards government and also on the structure of the formal labor market today, right? What happens when your initial interaction or your initial contact with the formal labor market is through coercion, right? So these like labor ordinances, prison systems, etc. So anyway, this is ongoing work, and thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed reading your paper, and I think you tell a very compelling story. And in the paper, I would actually even suggest to focus more on how much you're estimating a lower bound of the value of forced labor, because prison labor, as you said, is really only a small part of forced labor. And then you relate this to public works expenditures. And I think you make a very compelling case that it was really labor demand shortages driving an increase in convictions and an increase in prison sentences. And yes. So my one big comment is actually that I think you could get more out of your rainfall variable by refining it. So Nigeria is a very large country with 4 quite distinct climatic zones ranging from desert in the very north to quite humid tropical climates in the south, and you might have very different effects of rainfall shocks in these. So you might have much less risk of drought in the very arid areas, and yes, so it might be worth it to look at these a little bit by region. And also you're looking at 3 or 4 main cash crops, and I was wondering what are the time frames where rain is most important for these. So between the planting and harvest season, what is the time where you would need rain and how much would be too much rain? And actually, if these times happen to be different from the ones used for food crops for subsistence farming, you might even get into disentangling the mechanisms a little bit further. And then one more idea on using the rainfall is that as far as I understood, you're using average rainfall over the entire year, but not how variable this was throughout the year. So not whether you had flood first and then drought, which ends up looking like average rainfall. And yes, so in your paper you show a model that basically looks at 3 different pathways from economic situations to incarceration rates, 2 that would increase it, which is a reduced labor supply because the outside option becomes more attractive, or the increased labor demand through the government. And then in the post-colonial period, you show the poverty crime mechanism, which should, if it was also present in the colonial area, actually attenuate your results. And I know this would probably be very difficult, but I think it would be extremely interesting if you can go more deeply into these results, and especially if you could show the poverty crime mechanism was actually also present in the colonial era, and so which would make your results even stronger and sort of a lower bonus. Thank you very much.
Questions? Yeah, if you want.
I mean, as I mentioned, thank you very much again for the comments. This is a work in progress. And one of the things that we were trying to understand with the rainfall variable was also like, this came up before at another presentation, that the different crops have different growing seasons, so yeah, what is the relationship between rainfall and the kind of different cash crops that we mentioned, so that's something that we're going to check as well. And then yes, I do think that the not ruling out that the poverty crime story is something that's happening during the colonial period as well. Actually, one of the things that we wanted to look at especially was the Great Depression era. So this is 1929, 1930. You have the Depression. You see this fall in prices. So this is something that actually the prison administrators mention when they talk about like, oh, we think that there's an increase in the number of prisoners at this time because like, it seems like more theft is happening and things like that. And so that's something that we're going to look at in kind of the next future iteration of the analysis as well.
It's a very interesting paper. I haven't read it, but just based on the slides, you talk about the repartition of the prisons in Nigeria. So I was wondering if you had a sense of whether prisoners, when they're sent to jail, whether they're sent to the local jail, or whether some people are convicted, for instance, in North, but sent to a prison elsewhere.
Okay, so they move them around prisons?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a good question. One of the things that we are trying to figure this out right now, actually, because I think I showed, okay, I don't know what's happening in this slide. Well, I showed a map where I showed you the distribution of the prisons, and I mentioned that they're more heavily concentrated in the southern provinces and in the northern provinces, and there's a story there. But we do think that there is some movement of prisoners across prisons. Based on my kind of reading of the historical literature, it didn't seem to be as pronounced in that southern region that we were talking about. Not sure about that northern region. Prisons are more sparsely distributed, so presumably no. But that's something that we can definitely check more as we do this. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is joint work between Harvard Harland, who's at Stanford University, myself, and King Lim, who's at University of Nottingham. So basically, the presentation will take the following format. I'll give a background, which will also have some theoretical underpinnings and motivation for the paper. And then I'll give a brief, what I hope will be a brief overview of Kenya's macroeconomy. Then I'll go into the model, and in the interest of time, I hope to concentrate on the results and then give some conclusions. So Kenya recently discovered oil, and this oil is estimated at 750 million barrels of recoverable oil. So since we started working on this paper, there's been, information back and forth about whether it's 250 million recoverable million barrels of recoverable oil or 600 million barrels of recoverable oil. I mean, so we are still, we'll keep updating the paper as we get this information. For resource-rich countries, the permanent income hypothesis approach implies that for your non-resource primary deficit, your non-resource primary deficit should be limited to the present value of all future resource revenue. Now, in the very narrow sense of the permanent income hypothesis, this could be problematic, especially for developing countries, because it implies that you should save all your resources, or all your revenue from natural resources abroad in financial assets. So our contribution basically would be to say, suppose you devise more flexible fiscal management rules that could take into account investment in infrastructure and the social sector, while at the same time accounting for absorption of capacity constraints that are a problem for these developing countries. Some examples of countries that have recently discovered natural resources are Ivory Coast, Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda. So because this paper concentrates on Kenya, I'm going to just give a very brief overview of Kenya's macroeconomy. So in the past 10 years, growth has been at about on average 5.4%. And the only years of deviation from this average have been 2008, when Kenya had three shocks, one external, the financial crisis, and two internal shocks. One was from the political effects of the 2017 elections, where we had a bit of a post-election violence, and then compounded by a drought period in 2008. But the economy picked up, and in 2010, you can see the growth rate was about 8.4%, which is really basically just base effects. And the only other time, again, that growth deviated from this average of 5.4% is in 2017, again, an election year. And unfortunately, again, we had a double shock, so the election period was compounded by a drought. So we decided to break down this growth to look at what are the main sources of growth, and we use a very simple classical model with a Cobb-Douglas production function. The inputs are labor and capital, and you can see from the left-hand graph that capital has been the main driver of growth over the last 10 or so years. And of course, then there's labor, and productivity is a very small contributor, or doesn't contribute much to GDP growth in Kenya. Now, that story is consistent with the story that the government is increasing spending on infrastructure to ease supply-side constraints. And we can see this also reflected in the fiscal deficit. This is an overall balance, basically. And Kenya has a relatively high overall balance, but the government, in its medium-term expenditure framework, has put in place plans for a fiscal consolidation. And we see that after 2016-17, this is a fiscal year, where fiscal deficit was about 9.1%. There's the beginning of a fiscal consolidation in 2017-18 at 7.2%. Again, 2016-17 is probably also the effects of the drought and the elections. So Kenya in 2017 had two elections, which was very expensive. And because of the drought, the government had to import food, and they also introduced a temporary subsidy on maize meal, which is basically the staple food for Kenya that goes into ugali. And on the graph on the left, we see that the main driver of this fiscal deficit is really very much expenditure. So this is spending. This is the spending trend since between 2010, 2011 to 2018, 2017-18. 2018-19 is still an estimate, not confirmed yet. And the lower line is a trend for tax revenue. Tax revenue has been pretty much stable. In fact, it has moderated a little over the last 5 years, while spending is, it's increasing. Sometimes it's very much uneven. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases. So I think the main cause of the increase in fiscal deficit is basically the government spending. And if we just look at this, this data is actually from the IMF database. If we look at this if we look at the fiscal deficit as a share of tax revenue, then we see that because this is a ratio, then the denominator has remained pretty much the same, but the fiscal balance has been increasing. So you see the effects of this fiscal deficit as a share of tax revenue is becoming larger and larger. And what is the effect of this on government debt? Then you see a very steep increase in government debt As of 2017 December, debt was estimated at 57.7% of GDP. I think this number has come down to 55% in 2018. Again, preliminary estimates, so not confirmed. And then we have a graph that sort of estimates oil production. So the government plans to start the production of oil in 2022. There's been some delays, so it might not even be 2022, it might be after 2022. But just in case the production begins in 2022, it is expected to peak in 2026 and remain at that level until 2031, and then again begin a very slow, the production will begin again to decline. So because the expected recoverable oil is not that much, there's a report that was released by the World Bank, I think in 2013, that states that if Kenya produced oil at the level of Saudi Arabia, this oil would be finished within 1 year. So it's not that much oil. So a very quickly run through the model. Now the choice of the model is based on two objectives. So first we wanted to look at long-run scenarios associated with oil management for Kenya. And the second one is we abstract from the usual short-run stabilization policies and rather look at want to look at the structural effects of fiscal revenue of revenue from oil. And so the key features of the model are, it's a multisectoral dynamic general equilibrium model. It has households, governments, and producers of non-tradables and producers of tradables. In addition, we have capital good producers. And then we have the resource fund, and the novel aspect of this paper is actually the strategic investment fund, because what we want to do is basically try to see if you can have, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you can have some fiscal rules that take care of the nature of developing countries, that is that there's very little infrastructure and very little social development, but at the same time you have revenue, so do you invest it or do you save it abroad in financial assets? So the features of the Strategic Investment Fund, which is, again, the novel aspect here, is it's sponsored or fully capitalized by the government. It invests to achieve financial as well as economic returns. It aims to crowd in private capital to invest in key economic sectors. And then it operates it attracts expert investors on behalf of the sponsors, and then it provides long-term capital, primarily as equity. Examples of strategic investment funds are the Khazanah Investment Fund in Malaysia, and the FONSIS in Senegal. So Senegal, I think, does not even use resource revenue for this fund, but I think it's been cited as one of those that has been pretty much successful. So I think I'll skip over this in the interest of time. The model is calibrated for Kenya. I think you can find this in the paper. And quickly go to the results. So these are the baseline results, and the baseline is basically taking into what we do is we look at the data for Kenya and the medium-term expenditure framework, and we assume that the government will maintain the same path or the same policies that it has at the moment. And what we see is for GDP growth starts at about 4%, and by 2040 moderates to about, there's a spike in the years when we begin the production of oil and when oil is at its peak, but then it moderates again and goes back to about 4%. Then the second one is the primary deficit, which again declines in the years of the peak of oil production, that's between 2026 and 2031, and then again begins to widen to about 4% of GDP. The non-oil primary deficit, that just keeps widening to about 5% of GDP. And the most interesting one is debt. If the government continues on the current path, then debt goes to about 120% of GDP. And this is in the baseline. We assume that all revenue from oil goes into the budget. So then we tried to look at a baseline with some policy changes. So what we do is we assume that the government is looking into a fiscal consolidation. So what they're going to do is increase their revenue collection. And we see how this, and again here, all oil goes into, it's a full spending approach. So all oil goes into the budget, all oil revenue goes into the budget. Sorry. And what we have, GDP growth, again, very similar to what we had before, starts at 4%, and there are a couple of humps here in the year that oil production begins, and around the peak of oil production, but then again declines to about 5%. Most interesting one is debt, which is a secondary axis, by the way. So this is debt. That begins at around 55%, and then declines in the years of the, starts a decline in the years of the peak of oil production, but then goes back and settles at about 48%. So with policy changes, even where all revenue goes into the budget, then debt kind of moderates. Now these are the deviations from the baseline. So again, if we look at the full spending rule, and this is, in this case, this is the deviation, this is basically the difference between the first graph and the second graph. So the first graph where there are no policy changes and the second graph where there are policy changes, then growth remains pretty much, say very, very few deviations, and this is in, this is as a percent. So growth only changes or increases by about 2%. Debt actually doubles. And sorry, this should be the decline in, this should be declining debt. It halves, it doesn't double, it halves. And then we see the primary fiscal deficit. It declines by about 7% during the peak oil production season. And non-oil primary deficit increases. Then the full saving rule, where all oil revenue goes into the sovereign wealth fund and is invested in financial assets abroad. There's not that much difference from, the deviation is not that much from for GDP growth and for the non-oil primary deficit. There's a huge deviation in debt, which doubles. And then for the primary deficit, there's a decline in the primary deficit by about 8 to 10% during the peak period. The mixed management rule turns out to be the interesting one and the best, because what we see is growth actually increases by about 10%. And then non-oil primary deficit also declines, while at the same time the primary deficit also declines by about, during the end of the peak year or during the peak period of production, declines by about 10%. But the debt seems to double during the period. The reason for this is probably because the way we design the model is having a sovereign wealth fund reduces the interest rate at which the government can borrow. And this creates an incentive for the government to keep borrowing because interest rates are low. So what happens is the debt itself goes up as interest goes down. So there's an opposite effect. So the conclusion is the paper studies the dynamic effects of alternate spending and saving strategies for allocation of natural resource revenue. The novel feature in this paper is the Strategic Investment Fund, in addition to the Sovereign Wealth Fund. So Strategic Investment Fund invests locally as opposed to putting all the money in financial assets abroad. The model is calibrated for Kenya, a small open economy, and the results indicate that the mixed management rule has is the best spending option for Kenya. Thanks very much. Those are my contact details, and for my colleague King from the Nottingham Trent University.
Thank you for the paper. I will admit I am not a macro person, so I had to dig into my grad school DGE memories. So I will give you general comments on the model, just things that I kind of wanted points of clarification, but it was an interesting paper, and yeah, thank you for the presentation. Okay, so just to give a brief summary of the paper, so it's looking at what the optimal design of fiscal policy should be in kind of poor countries with large non-renewable natural resources, and then it uses this DGE model to study spending and saving strategies for allocating natural resource revenues. Especially, I think you frame this as within an economy that is infrastructure constrained, and estimates this model in Kenya and kind of tries to understand strategies for allocating the country's kind of newly discovered oil revenues and assess the impact on growth and fiscal sustainability by 2040, I think is the dates that you give, and finds that the optimal kind of fiscal policy strategy is this mixed management rule, right, where you have some saving and some expenditure on infrastructure, some kind of saving allocated to this resource fund, plus this combination of a high share of resources to the strategic fund, which is aimed at kind of investing in public infrastructure that would maximize economic growth, and particularly, without putting this kind of public debt sustainability at risk. So this was the kind of overview of the paper. So my comments are going to be mostly on the model assumptions. So I, again, was reading this and trying to dig up grad school memories. But one of the things that I had questions on is that you kind of assume that resource extraction is treated as exogenous in this model, and you said you were abstracting from hoteling here. So which I had some confusion about why, right? So at least my knowledge of this kind of natural resource kind of extraction literature, people usually use the hoteling assumptions, and you go from there. So just wanted a little bit of explanation why you decided to kind of abstract from hoteling, especially since you were doing this long-term horizon thing here. And then you mentioned that the stream of resource revenue was interpreted as exogenously given net profits / dividend stream projected by stakeholders. I needed clarification on that. I was not exactly sure what that meant in the paper. And again, why this assumption of exogenous, kind of exogenous net profits as this? So I guess maybe if you think of the price of oil as exogenous, but anyway, I wanted a little bit of clarification on that. And then on the charts of the time horizon, so you mentioned that you're projecting till 2040, and I wasn't sure whether there was kind of an arbitrary chosen date or if that was something that there was a rationale behind that. So just a little bit more explanation on that would be good as well. And when you had this model of kind of, you had 7 agents, I think, with households and the government and non-oil and all of that, I wasn't sure, maybe I missed this, if there was kind of a rule for trying to understand how not quite domestic, so it seems like you were focusing on domestic actors, but maybe like multinational oil companies, how do they fit into this model? Or non-domestic agents generally. And maybe, again, me trying to understand the model assumptions there. And then I just have one more comment on kind of overall modeling assumptions before I'll let kind of open its questions. So one of the things that is pretty common in these countries, right, these natural resource revenue countries, is this, they often have these revenue sharing formulas or schemes, right? So you have, it's not just like there's a centralized receipt of oil revenues to the national government, which then decides how much to spend on infrastructure. So at least in countries like Nigeria and about 30 other countries, I think according to the UN, you have these revenue sharing schemes that are more decentralized, right? So where the federal government will receive oil revenues and then distribute it among maybe local subnational actors like states or local governments, etc. So these schemes, you know, they have political reasons for doing this and trying to kind of appease areas, especially where resource extraction, like in Nigeria, the Niger Delta resource extraction has led to like the damage of fisheries and kind of local economy. So I was wondering then, given that these have become quite common among natural resource revenue countries, I'm assuming, I don't know if Kenya is thinking of doing something similar to this. I know it's very popular among these countries. What would then be the optimal investment mix under kind of a more decentralized revenue sharing scheme, like the one that Nigeria has, for instance? So just thinking through that, so I'm more familiar with that literature, but thinking through how would you, or would this model possibly change if you had a more decentralized revenue sharing scheme? So anyway, yeah, thank you, and I will end my comments there.
Thank you, Christine, for a good presentation. I have a question that probably would maybe have implications on the model. I know this is a standard DG model, but looking at the subject, this is natural resources, and we know that in Africa, we have a problem of collecting revenue, especially from natural resources. So I'm thinking whether it's possible to incorporate whether a parameter that would capture the extent to which the country, like Kenya, is able to collect its, revenue from natural resources. Even though, yes, we do have this scheme, I'm not sure whether you're taking it as exogenous or as if Kenya is good at collecting taxes in general. So the fiscal gap that we are seeing, or the fiscal deficit that we are seeing, in many countries, if we look at the ACBF, the Africa Capacity Building Foundation, the UN Agenda 2063, the biggest problem that they raise is our lack of capacity to actually collect the relevant revenues properly, or at least to ensure that we do not have capital flight as a result of the discovery of these resources. So is it possible to incorporate a parameter in your model that should capture some scenarios, should everything remain okay, that Kenya can actually collect its revenues properly, and if they are not able to, how would our results perhaps change? Thank you.
Right. I'm also interested in knowing the implication of oil price volatilities or changes, its implication on revenue collection, and how that will influence the overall simulations regarding the effects up to the 2040. Because if you assume the price to be the same as current, that can lead to, bias in the estimates so many years ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone, and thanks, Belinda, for the comments. I think I'll respond to them in reverse order, so I'll start with the last question first. So we used the World Bank pink sheet for oil price estimates, and that's how we calculate the the oil price, the resource revenue from oil based on the oil production. And this oil production estimate, of, when it reaches the peak and so on, we also use some previous work that was done by the World Bank. This was, I think, in 2013. So the extent to which a country is able to collect revenue or natural resources. So I'm not sure if we can actually factor that in. I think what we could do is explicitly state in the paper that based on the oil production and the oil prices, this is what we assume the oil revenue will be. I mean, we can discuss this after the session. I think Kenya's capacity has been estimated to be about 20% of GDP, but I know that in 2018 they only collected revenues of about 15% of GDP. So there are definitely capacity issues, but I'm not sure how we would factor this. There would also be a political aspect to this for sure. But yeah, I mean, we can talk about this after the session. So, and then the question on resource revenue sharing schemes. Oh yes, this I think was about the share in federal versus exactly. So Kenya is a semi-federal country. It's organized semi-fed. Until 2013, it was everything was very central. And after 2013, then there was the introduction of 47 counties, but it's not a fully federal state. So there are only certain functions like agriculture and health that are fully decentralized, and only education it's only early childhood education that is devolved to the counties. Everything else is from the central government. So there is a revenue sharing formula. And again, with oil revenues, I think there's a bill that has just been passed that part of the revenue is going to go to Turkana County, which is where the oil is, and the rest will go to the central government. So again, what we should do probably is mention explicitly in the paper that our assumption is whatever we are working with is what goes into. Oh yeah, no, actually, right. We should factor in and say, for example, that from all the revenues collected, 70%, which is what the new bill says will go to the central government, is what we are working with, and then adjust for that in the paper. So that's a very good suggestion. Thanks very much. The role of multinationals in oil companies. I think this you're referring to the Strategic Investment Fund. So the Strategic Investment Fund is what we wanted to show here was that it's a more efficient way of investing locally. So it will not be, it's not investment through the budget, but this the revenue actually goes through a strategic investment fund, and then this fund, which has the capacity and the expertise to deal with large-scale investments, then takes the lead in investing in infrastructure or even social sector investments through public-private partnerships or whatever it is that they do, but they're the experts. So in this case, we foresee absorption constraints already being dealt with, and therefore the efficiency of the Strategic Investment Fund is much higher than investing through the budget. And we treat oil prices as exogenous. Okay, yeah. Otherwise, I think I've in case there's anything I haven't responded to, maybe we can discuss later. The 2040 horizon, we wanted to look at peak of oil, and then when it starts to, when the oil production starts to decline. So we thought until 2040, we can of course expand it to 2050 or wherever, but yeah, we really just wanted to capture this peak oil production. Okay, thanks.
So now the next presentation was supposed to be given by Lucy, who unfortunately cannot be here today, so we're going to move straight into the fourth and last presentation of today. So I will be presenting today a paper on community-level electricity access and infant mortality. This is joint work with Alex Moadi, who unfortunately had to leave early and cannot be here. Overall, this is very preliminary work, so we would be very grateful for comments and feedback. So overall, we investigate the effects of community-level electricity access on infant mortality in rural and semi-urban areas of Burkina Faso. And we find that infant mortality rates decline quite substantially by about 5 percentage points as soon as electricity is set up somewhere close to the community. And this cannot be explained by an increase in household level electricity access, but rather it seems to be a community level effect. We also do some exploratory analysis on potential mechanisms, and we cannot pin these down with certainty at this point, but it looks like nutrition is an important channel here. So just to give you an overview of our empirical strategy, our main strategy is a definitive strategy where we use 4 rounds of DHS surveys and compare communities that get connected to the grid at different points in time. And to ensure identification, we compare pre-trends in the treatment and control areas, and we also do some propensity score adjustments. Then as another robustness checks, we will use some duration analysis because in the main setup we have to truncate our sample quite substantially to avoid censoring bias. And then finally, we explore some mechanisms. So just to give you a bit of background on motivation, essentially the policy question we would like to weigh in on here is whether the benefits of electricity access and rural electrification justify the quite high costs. And in Asia, Latin America, and also in South Africa, studies have found that electricity access can lead to quite high increases in income or household expenditure and quite substantial reductions in the classical poverty indicators. However, for most sub-Saharan African countries, and specifically in West Africa, the findings are much more mixed. So a lot of studies find either very small or no increases in income and household expenditure. However, of course, this is not the only outcome of interest. And there is some sort of very descriptive evidence that household level electricity access is correlated with reductions in infant and child mortality. And also there's a paper from 2003 that globally looks at community characteristics and child mortality and finds that electricity access is correlated with child mortality. And so we would like to find a causal link here, and this ties in quite nicely with emerging literature on the importance of community characteristics for infant and child mortality. So a little bit of background on Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso has a poverty rate of about 40 to 43% of people living in extreme poverty. And the infant mortality rate has decreased, but it is still unacceptably high. In 1990, which is shortly before the starting period of our data analysis, it was over 10%. So over 10% of infants died before their first birthday. And it has recently decreased to more in the realm of 6 to 7%. But this is still very high, and it's actually even higher in the very rural areas. And at the same time, the population in Burkina Faso with access to electricity has increased quite dramatically from a very tiny 3% in 1990 to almost 20% in 2014. And this is mainly due to a government policy instituted in 2004, which started to roll out electricity on a grant scheme to communities throughout the country, and this became an integral part of the poverty reduction strategy. So the government, for about 10 years, rolled out electricity access to a large number of communities, and the guiding principle of the government here seems to have been not that specific regions should be favored for some reason or other, but rather that they wanted to increase the overall number of people with access, and then costs of connection determined which communities got access to electricity. So we use two main sources of data. One is electrification data. This is provided by the government in their annual statistical reports, and also by the national electricity provider Sonabel. And so we created a map of all the localities electrified between 1954 and 2014. And we combine this with 4 rounds of DHS data from 1993 to 2010. This has information on child health and mortality. It has approximate GPS locations for each household cluster, and it also has information on whether the specific household has access to electricity. Now, unfortunately, we do not know if this electricity access is through the national grid or through private generators, etc. So how do we combine this data? Well, for every household cluster, we draw a 15-kilometer radius around this cluster, and then we see whether electrified community, an electrification point, as we call it, is within this radius. If it is not, then we consider the household cluster to be unelectrified, without access to electricity. If it is, then we assign this cluster to the electrification year of 2005, saying it received electricity in 2005, and we also assign it to this specific electrification point, which is how we will create location fixed effects through our sample. If there's more than one electrification point, we take the one with the earlier year of electricity access. Now, a main variable of interest is infant mortality or infant death. This is simply 1 if the child died before the first birthday and 0 otherwise. And then our treatment is on the point of the electrification point. So this is the point that has been assigned to the household cluster. And we will use these to group households from the same or also from different surveys across our 4 survey rounds. Additionally, we add some information on population density around each household cluster. We use this from 1990 to make sure that there's nothing endogenous. This is before our period of observation and treatment start. And we also use distance to the nearest major road from this time frame. Now, our main treatment variable combines 2 sources of time variation. First of all, one is on the cluster level. So we define all areas as treatment areas if they were electrified between 2005 and 2008, and as control areas if they were electrified between 2012 and 2014. So we can compare these in our 2010 DHS survey. So for these areas, we have pre-treatment observations from 1993 to 1999, 2003, and then we have post-treatment in 2010. So this is what it looks like on the map. As you can see, so the blue dots here are the control electrification points, the pink ones are the treatment ones. As you can see, these are all over the country, but they're not always balanced. Specifically here in the Sahel region, we have only control observations. So how we deal with this is that we only use the areas in which we have both control and treatment observations. Specifically, we go by the administrative regions. There are 13 administrative regions, and we have to exclude 4 of them to make sure that we have a balanced sample. So this is what electricity access looks like in our treatment and control groups. So as I mentioned, we have whether the household has electricity in our DHS survey. So we use this to check whether we are actually seeing an increase in electricity, and we do. So as you can see, electricity access was almost non-existent pre-treatment, and then it does increase in our treatment group after the treatment, but uptake is still very low at about 4%. So only about 4% of households have access to electricity in these electrified communities. Now, infant mortality actually starts out higher in our treatment communities. So the national average here is about 12%. So in our treatment, we are slightly above this, and in our control areas, we're actually below it. And as you can see, after the treatment, infant mortality seems to decrease, but it's not ex ante clear if there's any significant change happening here. And so we look at some observables in our 3 pre-treatment periods between our treatment and control areas. And I'm not going to go through all of these in the interest of time, but as you can see, it looks fairly balanced. Now, the second source of time variation we have is actually on the infant level. So within our treated communities, we have infants that were born before or after treatment. So let's say we have a survey collected in 2010 in a community that was electrified in 2008. Then, of course, an infant born in 2006 will not have been affected by this. So we only look at infants that were born either during or after the year of treatment. And we have to, unfortunately, exclude all infants that were born less than 1 year before the survey to avoid censoring bias in our infant mortality variable. And so we combine this variation with the variation in the clusters to create our treatment variable, which is called affected by community electrification. And this is one if the child was born in a treated community after or during the treatment. So we estimate this model. Our outcome is infant death or infant mortality. Then we have our treatment here, which depends on the infant's birth year T and the electrification point that the cluster is assigned to. And we add some controls on the infant, mother, and household level. And we also add some regional fixed effects. And oh, unfortunately, I'm very sorry, this R here is supposed to be an L. So this is actually the electrification point fixed effect. So for every treatment or control area, we have a time invariant location specific fixed effects. So we're controlling for time invariant differences in all of our treatment and control locations. And then we add some region and birth year fixed effects, and in some specifications we interact them. So moving on to results, as you can see, we observe about a 4 to 5 percentage point decrease in the probability of infant death if the infant was affected by community level electricity access. And this holds while introducing all kinds of controls on the child, mother, and community level. So on the community level, we're controlling essentially for how urban the area is, by using population density and distance to roads. And then here we have our full set of fixed effects. And now the most interesting result is that this does not change at all if we introduce whether the household has access to electricity. So this is not really surprising given that we had a very small number of households with actual access to electricity. And so this is not significant, but also it does not change our results on the community level effect. So this really seems to be driven exclusively by a community level effect. Now, as a robustness check, we do some propensity score adjustments. So essentially we trim our sample, and then what is called block 1 here is the half of the sample that has the lower propensity scores. We're using this because here the propensity scores are balanced between treatment and control communities. So essentially the takeaway here is that our magnitude does not really change. And then we also do some duration analysis. Maybe I skip over this. We do a little bit of exploratory analysis. Essentially, the first thing we want to do is make sure that we're not capturing the effects of some other public good provision that is rolled out at the same time. And so we cannot check for this directly, but we find that being born after electricity treatment does not predict any of the major healthcare outcomes. So it does not increase the number of hospital births, the probability of skilled birth attendance or prenatal care, it does not increase vaccination rates, and it does not predict treatment on the community level. Now we have some mixed evidence on whether it increases the access to piped water, which would actually be a sensible channel from electricity access through better water provision to reduced infant mortality. Now next we do a little bit of mediation analysis where again we take our measures of medical treatment or access to medical care as well as some wealth indicators to see whether this changes our results, and as you can see it does not. And finally we are looking at now the living children in our treated and controlled communities. And we find that for all the living children under 5, short-term nutrition improves quite a lot. So the weight for height z-scores increase by about 1/3 to almost half of a standard deviation. So it looks like for the living children, nutrition improved. And so one possible reason for this could be access to refrigeration at the community level, and unfortunately we cannot check for this directly, but we do find that children under 2, for whom we have information on what they were fed in the last 24 hours, are more likely to have been fed milk. So this would be a sign that potentially access to refrigerated goods increased. So just to conclude, we find that community-level electrification consistently and significantly reduces infant mortality, and that this reduction is quite sizable for up to 5 percentage points. And this does not seem to be driven by household-level electricity access, which means that even if uptake is low, there might still be community-wide positive effects of electricity access. And the mechanisms are still unclear, but it suggests that nutrition may play a role in this. Thank you very much. And unfortunately, I do not have a discussant because Lucy could not come today. So if you have any questions.
Thank you. Ujunwa is my name. Very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you took note of any healthcare facility improvements in any of the communities or generally as part of the assessment, and if maybe those improvements could have caused the reduction in infant mortality. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation, Maika. It was really interesting. First question, I'm sure you've looked into that, but why do you present results with a 15-kilometer buffer? I know that THS clusters can be moved up to 10 kilometers, I think, so I was wondering why the 15-kilometer buffer. And my second question, maybe it's in the paper, but I would be interested to know more about what electricity changes in communities, because you say people don't have individual access to the community, so I guess some maybe some small shops have access to the electricity, but it would be interesting if you could tell us more about that, or maybe find ways, maybe look at qualitative works on what changes. So are there more street lights? I'm thinking whether there is a way you could think about what really changes. And about the other infrastructure, I was wondering about roads. So whether like to build some, to bring, like to have access to the grid, whether you're also building some roads, and this would mean, I guess, better access to markets and to better also, it could be linked to better nutrition outcomes. So whatever you've looked into that, that's it.
Sorry if I missed this, but I'm curious to know if you've looked at fertility at all as an outcomes, because we can create a number of stories for why electrification may change a household's decision to have children, and if it's led to a reduction in fertility, it's going to have these spillovers on things like nutrition, breastfeeding, other outcomes that will affect child health.
Thank you. One or two comments again. Okay, maybe I'll start with the last one. Was looking at milk, increase in intake of milk. May I ask whether this was fresh milk, powdered milk, or breast milk? What does the question say? So that would have definitely implications on which milk is refrigerated or not. Then the other question is, I noticed that yes, you have wealth quintiles there. So I was just trying to see the extent to which you're measuring access or affordability. I know that in South Africa, where I'm from, yes, there is rural electrification, but then the government goes ahead a step further to give vouchers, staggered, or vouchers at least, because electricity is, the cost is high, but at least it's a subsidy for the lower end households. So I'm not sure whether there is such a facility as well in Burkina Faso. Okay, if it's not there, then so we're clear it's not the affordability, a mix-up between access and affordability in your case, because that's what I was trying to check, whether you're not actually, whether you're distinguishing between access and affordability. Because it's not enough for me to have electricity in here, but can I really afford it? And then finally, it's a case of exposure for the mothers to electricity. So this would go to trying to think about how you can measure that. I just kind of forgotten, but yes, some parents might be more exposed to electricity than others, and that would probably also have an implication on the child, or on the kids actually they give birth to. So those three comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, but I have two comments, or one is half a comment, half a question. So I wasn't too clear about your theory of change. Because you're looking at electricity, right, at a communal level, and electricity, unlike other social infrastructure, is quite excludable, right? I mean, the consumption of electricity, access to electricity can be excludable, right? If it's not connected to your home, even if there are externalities, it might be very little. And you looking at it from a child health outcome, probably in the final paper, if you could clearly map up your theory of change, it will be very clear, and it will more or less support your argument. And even it will help you in clearly mapping up the mechanisms through which the communal access affects child outcomes. The second comment is you could also try mother fixed effect, right? I mean, in that instance, you are comparing the outcomes of children born before the communal access versus those that were born after for the same period, so that you more or less control for all other, mother specific effects that could either confound your analysis in this case. Thanks.
Sorry, I remembered something. And related to what he's saying, is it possible for you to take advantage of, actually to check children born of the same mother? Because that period that you have before, it's possible that one parent has more than one children, so that you can get that from, I think, the birth order in the DHS, and you're able to now compare, to check children of the same mother before and after. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for all of these questions and comments. I will try to address all of them, and I hope I don't forget any. So the first question was about data on health centers, and unfortunately we have not been able to find any data on health centers and their equipment. We would love that, because we would love to check whether the health centers received access to electricity and improved their service, could, for example, refrigerate vaccinations, etc. Unfortunately, we have not been able to find this data. So if you have any ideas of where we could get this data, that would be extremely helpful. And then the second question was on the 15-kilometer buffer. This is actually a very good question, and I forgot to mention this in the presentation. So our DHS household clusters are removed, 99% of them in rural areas are removed by up to 5 kilometers randomly around the true location, and 1% is removed up to 10 kilometers around the true location. And we don't really have information on how large these towns or villages typically are, but from looking at satellite data, it looks like the vast majority of them is no more than 5 kilometers in diameter. And so 15 kilometers seemed to us a reasonable range to look at, but more specifically, we checked whether, when using different ranges, how well this predicted household level access to electricity. So if we made the radius significantly larger, then we find no predictive power anymore of how many households have access to electricity. And if we make it smaller, then our sample decreases in size quite substantially. So this is how we ended up with a 15-kilometer radius. And then there were a couple of questions in the vein of what does electricity actually change in the communities. So unfortunately, we do not have data on this, but we have some theories. And specifically, so from the water angle, you do not need to have electricity on the household level as long as there's electricity in the village and someone has installed a water pump. So you might have access to clean water on the community level, even if you do not have access to electricity yourself. And then especially in communities that are close to market centers or larger shops, if these market centers and shops receive access to electricity, they receive access to refrigeration, they can store things longer, they can sell more fresh produce and animal products. And another theory that we would really like to test, but we have not been able to find agricultural data, is that it might improve access to water, not just clean water, but overall for irrigation purposes. So it might improve sort of small-scale farming and especially planting of vegetables throughout the year and not just in specific wet seasons. And then, of course, there is the healthcare angle that potentially if health centers receive access to electricity or community centers receive access to electricity, there is public service provisions that potentially everyone can benefit from. Yes, then there's a question about roads. And so we only control for roads, and I had actually not thought about interacting the distance to roads with our treatment effect, which is very interesting because this could be potentially a mechanism for looking at market access. Thank you very much. Then about the fertility question, so this is a very short time frame. Essentially, we're observing communities that received access to electricity sometime between 2005 and 2008, and we're observing them in 2010. So I'm not sure how much scope there was for changing fertility behavior in this area, but so our only measure of fertility that we have is parity, and this does not change significantly. Then there was a question about what kind of milk. So yes, this is cow's milk. We're not looking at breast milk. All of these children, 98% of them are being breastfed as well. But after 6 months of age, you do need additional feeding to achieve good nutrition outcomes. And so what we're looking at here is both fresh and pasteurized and tinned milk. Unfortunately, we cannot distinguish between those. Then there was a question on affordability, and we do not look at affordability at all here simply because access is so low that we do not have enough observations to look into differences in affordability here. But clearly this is a constraint to receiving access on the household level. So then there was a question about the fixed effects. So yes, fixed effects we are controlling for are birth years throughout the entire country, and then the interaction of birth year with being in a specific one of the 13 administrative regions. So we have an overall time trend as well as region-specific time trends, and then we have location-specific time invariant fixed effects, looking at each treatment and control area and sort of taking out the static differences between those. And I think I answered all of the questions. Thank you very much. We have one more question here. Do we have time for one more question?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to see if you can try, I'm looking at community level usage. So for example, if it's television or fridges, the number of households in the community that uses those kind of gadgets, so that you see either it is because of externalities, that when many people in the community are using that one, probably other people who are not using it may be able to. That's the path through where you get this.
Hi, yeah, it's just a minor comment or question. Why do you use road network from the 1990? Just this.
Okay, thank you very much. So about the first question, yes, this is a very good idea to look at the share of people using certain appliances. Unfortunately, we only have data on about 15 to 20 households per cluster, and there are simply too few appliances for us to pick up anything. So on average in the sample, about 2% of households have a refrigerator. And so on the community level, we simply do not have enough power to pick up differences here. And then the other question, why we're looking at roads pre our study period. So this is basically because we wanted to avoid any endogenous effects. So you might build a road to a newly electrified area, and so we just wanted to control for pre-differences in the original urbanization of this area. And also road data is not available until the end of our study period, so we could not look at the overall changes until the end. Thank you. Thank you very much.